Hello, this is Nick Pellegrino from asileFX, and in this training I'm going to start by showing you some techniques for creating more realistic ecosystems, some different control techniques based on more real-world ecosystem growth and object placement. And the first technique I want to show you involves the way trees grow, really depending on where the sun is positioned and the grouping of other trees around it. The scene that I currently have showing is just kind of a representation of the cutaway of the edge of a forest. And I'm using 5 maple trees, all somewhat modified. Some of the different settings changed, and we'll take a look at that once we start creating the ecosystem. But basically what we have are leaves more at the top of the trees. Once we get into the forest, the trees and the branches growing more inward to capture more light. Around the edge of the forest, you'll find trees are a little more slanted or curving towards the light. And the amount of filling and smaller plants around that edge, you'll also notice. As you can see, I have one tree down here. This is kind of going underneath the ground plane a little. And having an ecosystem that represents and shows this sort of structure will help remove all of the tree trunks around the edge of the forest, unless it would be to the back of the sun. And the sun right now is on the right side of the scene, so basically the negative x direction, and everything's kind of lining up towards that. There are several different ways to achieve this effect, and I'm going to show you a couple of ways to easily do this, also to minimize the amount of plants needed or editing, and to have some really efficient setups. Also reusable setups. Now, some of these operations cannot be dynamically or automatically controlled, and they become more difficult once entering an ecosystem. For instance, the bending of the trees. This sort of an operation, what I've done is just, for the example, taken the wind hand along top to bend it. Now, within the plant editor, I'm going to go ahead and edit one of these objects and pull that up. This can basically be achieved by using the droop function, provided the angle is set properly to achieve the effect. The only problem is you can't really determine or set a finite amount or a finite angle, so it will be completely random. And once the trees are rotating around, they're all going to be facing different directions. You can turn off the rotation within the ecosystem. The only problem is then you're going to have a bunch of trees that are identical, and that's going to really cut down on the realism, and it's just going to look like a bunch of duplicates of the same tree. So we may not be able to bend them all over without spending a lot of time setting that up. But there are a lot of other ways to achieve this look. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and close out this scene and start up a new one, and we can take a look at working on the ecosystem. So in a new scene here, I'm going to go ahead and add in just a standard terrain for now. And I'm going to go over to the scale in the numerics tab and increase its size to 1024 by 1024 meters. And let's go ahead and set the height to 100 meters. I want to have a little better looking terrain. So we can edit the terrain, go into the terrain editor, and I'm going to use the canyon preset followed by peak. And then come over here to the global effects in the effects tab, and we can use some terraces. Go ahead and double the resolution of the terrain. Start to use the peak mode, plateaus, dissolve that out. Use some of the alluvium erosion, go back dissolve. And that should give us a nice variation to start out with. Where we have some more equal areas. And what we're going to be using is slope to define some of these different techniques. It's a very good way to control an ecosystem. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off the frame guides, the framing strips, so we can see a little bit more of the scene. Maybe I'll also go up F4 on the keyboard for the atmosphere editor, or up at the top, atmosphere editor. Go to the sun tab and just increase the pitch of the sun to 18 degrees. And now we can select the terrain, go up and edit the material, and then select ecosystem. I'm just going to add an ecosystem layer. I'm going to start by adding in a plant. We're going to go ahead and start with that maple tree. Populate really quick just to get an idea of scale. And that should match up pretty well. So one thing we can do to kind of border the terrain or border the ecosystem and have the smaller plants around the edges without having to modify and create a new species is to drop down, basically lowering the objects underneath the terrain. But we want to control that and do that just around the edges of the ecosystem. And what we need to do is under the Density tab, under Offset from Surface, just switch it over to the proportion of the size of the instance, so the size of the tree. And we're going to be connecting a function to this control so that it's not equal, because we don't want all the trees going underneath the terrain, just the ones around the edges. So we need to define exactly where the edge of the forest is, the edge of the ecosystem. And right now I'm just going to be using the slope in order to control that. So I'm going to increase the density of our terrain. And this is probably going to be easier to see and demonstrate with a slightly taller terrain, something with some steeper cliffs. So we'll go ahead and change the height and the size of the Z, the terrain, to 200, which will also stretch out the ecosystem instances until we repopulate, unless we're using dynamic pop. So what I want to do is go over to the Environment tab, and now our slope range is going to be defined between 0 and 1. Right now we have the slider available to go -1, but that just doesn't exist and it'll never work because slope below 0, 0 to -1, would be the underneath side of the terrain, and since we cannot populate ecosystems in that manner, because it is a downward population, anything below 0 is null for slope. This density can be controlled either through the variable density or using the Environment tab. So let's go ahead and start with the Environment tab, set the slope range to 0.6 to 1, and that way we'll leave some of those steeper slopes unpopulated. And what we're going to do is shrink down and scale the maple trees around the edge, so at the starting slope, which is 0.6. So go back, edit the material. What I want to do right now is reduce the minimum size variation, because this size variation is pretty random. We want to have more of a direct control over that. Right now I'm going to bring it down to 0.1 so that you can mostly just see the same size tree, and you'll be able to see that drop down below the surface a little bit better. So going back over to the Density tab, we have the Offset from Surface, and what we want to do is drive this with a function. Now the output of this is a little different than some of the other outputs. Normally we're working between -1 and 1. That does not work the same way with this function. 0 is -1 in the function, and if we want to go below, we need to find out the limitation or the total amount we would need to drop these objects down. So we just need to kind of play around with it. I'm going to go ahead and bring it down to negative. Let's go ahead and type in negative 50 and populate. And that looks like it might be okay. And this is going to affect everything at the moment. But once we select to drive it with a function, it will create a constant node that will give us the number output of the current setting. So that way we know what to define. I'm going to turn off decay near foreign objects, faster population, and we don't want any influence of the ground plane. Let's go ahead and try negative 60 and populate. And I think that's going to be a little bit better, cutting off most of the trunks so that we just see those leaves. And now we need to make it so it only affects the outer edge, or just on the starting point of the slope. So we're going to drive it with the function, and the constant node it's created is set to a number of negative 121. So that is our equivalent of 60% negative. And once again, 0 is negative 1 and not 0. If you need to find out any value, you can disconnect the function, set the percentage in the material editor, and then when you extract it or say drive with function, it will create a constant that will tell you the number output that you need to get that exact point. So since we're going to be using slope, we'll go ahead and bring the slope input a little bit closer. And this is going to return a value of 1 to negative 1. And I'm going to connect disconnect from the constant, connect to the slope. We can take a look, see the preview. So on the top, we have 1, and on the bottom, negative 1. Once again, anything below 0 is null in this case. So we need to use a control in order to say that this controls a different number, because of course we need an output of negative 121 in order to get that to work properly. So what we're going to do is select the length between the slope and the offset from surface, add in a filter, and then we're going to change the filter over to the map filter. This is a really good direct control where we can enter in the values. And our lower value for the input range, we're going to clip to 0, since anything below 0 is null, and our upper value of 1. So now we need to basically tell Vue, when we hit that lower value of 0, it's going to equal what output. So actually this lower value of the input range, in this case, should be changed to what we have the slope setting in the environment tab, which was 0.6. So we can get a more accurate amount by typing in 0.6, and then our lower value and upper value need to be set. So it was negative 121, and that's going to be our lower value, and negative 1 to represent 0, which will be equal to 1, which is the top value. Another thing we need to make sure we do is clip the out of range values. If not, what's going to happen is it's going to take anything below 0.6 and create a bunch of instances below the terrain that won't even be in Vue. So now we're going to go ahead and populate. And if we're not seeing enough influence, what we can do is adjust that input value in order to get them to drop down a little bit more. But you can already start to see the terrain or the ecosystem starting to go below around on that rim. So we just need to adjust the slope influence as the starting point. And we'll go back into the function, and we need to adjust the lower value. Let's go ahead and bring it up a little bit higher to 0.7. Click OK. And it should drop it down. If we need to reduce the overall amount, we can cut down the lower value. So in other words, we don't want to have a smooth transition. We just want a thinner rim to move down below the terrain, so we can take the upper value and bring it down a little lower. So if we wanted, we could set this to 0.6 and then 0.7 for the upper. So now we just have a 0.1 value. It looks like we do need to go the other way around with that. So let's do 0.8, 0.9. And now we can see that those trees around the edge are dropping down below the terrain. So anywhere we have trees on the steeper part of the slope, it's going to populate them below the terrain. And that is based on the size of the instance. We don't want an absolute value for this because all the trees are going to be different sizes. So let's go ahead and increase the density. You can see that a little bit better. And we shouldn't really see any major or extremely noticeable trunks where the terrain is cutting away. If we need to adjust the overall slope range, we can do that in the Environment tab. We may need to adjust the other function as well. So it really depends on the terrain and the output of the terrain slope. Let's go ahead and take a look at a render. And I am using a shadow map with a rather low ratio, so that does need to be increased to get more shadows on the tree leaves. But you can definitely see that edge where we have, instead of having to create another vegetation object, we can just use the same one, dropping it down, instead of having to create another file, and more dependence for the scene to rely on. So less resources being needed. The density on that was a little high. Let's go ahead and bring it down to 80. We can repopulate. Actually, it looks like even that. Not quite enough. We'll do 85. I'm going to increase the sampling quality to 2. Should be a little more accurate. Especially when you're working with anything that relies on slope or altitude, you can get a much more accurate value or output from the ecosystem by using an increased sampling quality. And it does, really depending on the size of the object, it might create too much of a grid effect if we go a little higher than 2. But that's going to depend on the ecosystem and the terrain. A lot of variables. There's no set amount. So we'll just go ahead and take a look at another render. And you can see that a little bit better now with having some spacing in between the trees. And it's just a really good variation overall to increase the realism. Now I do want to go to the sunlight, and I need to increase the ratio amount. Ratio of 1 is equal to the size of the frame, so the total size of the render, with the shadow map itself being 4096, the max you can make for a shadow map. So what we can do is increase the ratio to a higher amount in order to increase the shadow calculation, increase the amount of shadows seen. So we can go ahead and bring this value up to 8, and we should see something that looks a little bit better. So now with a higher ratio, we can see that more of the tree itself is casting a shadow rather than the large clumps of trees. The leaf colors themselves for the maple tree need to be edited because they're just don't look right. They're not very realistic. They're a little too a pale blue. So if we did want to change that, what we can do is go over to the Material tab and select the maple leaf, double-click on it, and change the overall color. Going to go ahead and bring it more of a desaturated green, slightly darker. Trying not to make too much of an impact because it is going to affect the branches, and it could return a purple output for the color of the branch if modified too much. Depending on the saturation amounts. It is kind of doing that right now. But it's not too noticeable. The grass does need to be changed as well, because that does not look like grass. But I'm not really going to worry about that at the moment. And it looks like the color of those trees, that's not going to work. Let's go ahead and just edit the material. And I'm going to reset the color and worry about that a little bit later. Rather than fixing it right now. We'll go back into the terrain material, and for the ecosystem, we have some other options. Taking a look at the scaling and orientation, One thing we can do is shrink at low densities. Now the low density areas are going to be, in this case, by the edge or the slope edge, depending on the overall density amount, which will make it a little patchier. This allows us to shrink down the trees after the population has already been applied. So the placement of the trees is calculated before they are shrunk down. So you're really not able to go in before the population and shrink them down with this function, although it can still be done with the variable scaling function. So what we can do is now shrink down some of those trees in the lower density areas just by using that function. And that works pretty well when you're driving that with the slope in order to kind of fill in with some more bush-like trees. And really just kind of using the tops. Now this is how we would do this with only one tree. If you want to have a different set of trees or a mixture of trees, you could do that as well, just by adding in another tree to the scene. So let's go ahead and add in, at least use the plum tree. These are very quick trees. One thing I want to mention, if you're just not familiar with it, the first row and in a little bit further are the really old Vue trees. In other words, the very low polygon amounts. So basically it goes up to, I guess the cypress is one of the older ones. And then pretty much when we hit the white oak, anything beyond that, those are higher quality trees. A lot of them not meant for large scale ecosystems. And you would want to use those for close-ups. So these first set of trees really work best for ecosystems because of how low the low amount of polygons they have. They are old. They've been around since the earlier versions of Vue, and they just don't work very well for close-ups. But for everything else, they work quite well. So the plum tree is a lot smaller than the maple tree, so I'm going to increase the overall scale of this to 0.2. We can go ahead and populate. So now we just have a mixture between the plum tree and the maple tree, and the function to move it below the terrain is going to be applied equally between these trees. If we would just want to have the plum trees on the outside being the smaller trees, either in combination with using the offset or just the fact that they're smaller themselves, so they will automatically kind of block out the edges and fill in that space, what we can do is use a presence control, which is a really powerful way to modify an ecosystem. And for this ecosystem, what I want to do is have the plum trees around the edge and then the maples on the inside. So what I want to do is distribute the population, driving it with the function. And now the way the numbers work on this, don't worry about that -3 value. It's only going to go to -1 for the influence. The way the number controls work, it's divided equally between the amount of instances within the population. So in this case, we have 2. And the maple tree, anything or whatever we're using to control this distribution, whatever we connect it to, the values between -1 and 0 are going to control the maple tree. Between 0 and 1, they'll control the plum tree. So if we add more to the population, we need to divide that range between -1 and 1 equally. So what we can do is connect back to the slope and add in another filter, the map filter. Clip the outer range values. A lower value will be 0.6, upper value will be 1, and that's for the input range. The output, now I want the plum trees on the outside, and this is going to be different because I loaded in the maple tree first and not the plum. so we need to reverse it. So our lower value will be 1, and our upper value, -1. Because we still need, in this case, the output range to be 1 to -1. And if it's not creeping in far enough, all you need to do is increase the lower value. So let's bring it up to 0.7, and they're starting to come in a little bit. Let's go ahead and bring it all the way up to 0.8, and we'll start to see more of those plum trees, and just around the steeper areas of slope. Now, one thing we're seeing is an equal density distribution throughout the ecosystem. So even though the maple trees are much larger, that ends up leaving large gaps between the plum trees compared to the plum trees being much smaller, and then the way the population works, there are just much larger gaps in between them. So what we can do is increase the overall density. That's one way to kind of achieve that. But then we have too much density of the maple trees. So what we can do is use a function in the same way, connecting to the slope to limit the overall density amount for the flatter zones to affect the maple trees, or the steeper slopes to affect the plum trees. Right now what I'm going to do is bring the sampling quality down to 0, repopulate. We'll go ahead and take the overall density, bring it down to 90, maybe 95. And that should fill us in a little bit better. Sometimes you may not notice everything being perfect, because it really depends on the relationship between the sizes of the ecosystem instances. So we are seeing a lot of the trunks because of the way the scaling is worked out. And that's because a lot of these plum trees might be going below the terrain. I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale and the overall scale to 0.3. And if you take a look to the presence, once we've connected that to a function, the number output it expects is returned and shows up underneath the presence option. So rather than it being a total amount, which before was 1 for each, or you reduce the amount to decrease the amount of that instance within the overall population, now that we have a direct control, it's going to tell us what we need to do, which number output to affect in order to change that population instance. So we 0 to 1 for the plum tree, and -1 to 0 for the maple. This may not update when you add new objects. Before I go ahead and do that, now that I have increased population, I'm just going to go ahead and render this out so you can take a look at it. And then I'm going to add another tree into the population. So there we can see that rendered. The maple tree standing out a lot more, different colors, really separating them. Edit the material. And what I want to do is add in another plant. And since we cannot add the same plant, we'll go ahead and add in a fir tree, because we can't duplicate. Now what it's done is it has updated the fir tree, creating the correct number outputs. So it does look like that is actually working correctly. The fir tree is an extremely small tree compared to the rest. We'll go ahead and bring that scale up. There were some problems in the past where that number output wasn't showing up correctly or being calculated, but it does look like that is now working correctly. So that's good. So whenever you're working with the distribution of presence, it's really important to think about the order in which you're loading the trees in. For instance, if I wanted to mix in some dead trees with the rest of these trees, but we want the sizes to be somewhat equal, we need to pay attention to that population order. In this case, what I want to do is just remove the current population and go to drive with the function, I'm going to bring the output value lower to -1, upper to 1, and just load them in correctly this time. So add in a plant and start with whatever's going to be on the edge or the lower output. So I'm going to use the plum tree, and then add in another plant and select the winter plum tree. Now, here's the exception to the older plants, that the winter plum tree is a fairly low polygon tree, although it is somewhat newer. But it's more on the scale of the plum tree, just without leaves. The large dead tree is actually quite large and more of a maple tree variation. So we'll do the plum tree winter as the second in the population, and now we're going to add in the maple and then the maple dead tree. So let's use the large dead tree. Now, the distribution of these is going to be equal. So go ahead and populate. We should have just as many of the dead trees. The scaling is a little bit off right now, so let's go ahead and take that plum tree, bring it up to 0.3 to equal the regular plum tree. So if we need to limit the amount of these trees showing, we have to go into the function and really kind of work with that area and cut out the zone. That really might be a little bit too much work depending on the size of the scene, the amount of variation you need. And by driving it with a function, we lose the ability to just directly type in a number. So what we can do instead is work with multiple layers. So in this case, what we want to do is remove, let's go ahead and let's just remove the entire population. Disconnect the function driving the presence, add in our plant. We're going to start with the maple tree because now we're working on the flatter zone to start with. I'm going to take the slope range, bring it up to 0.8, go back, add in plant, large dead tree, and then what we want to do is add in another ecosystem. So we're going to select the main material, select ecosystem, which will add another one in. Just push up to raise that above the current ecosystem layer. Add in a plant. We're going to use the plum tree, and then add in plum tree winter. Changing those scales a little higher. We might need to match some of the size variations, and I'm not worrying about using the offset from surface right now. And I'm going to take the slope range on this and set it to 0.6 to 0.8. So kind of filling in those other areas as before. And this way we could just have two separate populations to mix these trees. And then we can adjust the presence amount using a number. So let's go ahead and take the winter tree, set it to 0.1, and then the large dead tree, 0.1, repopulate each of these layers. And that way we have less of those dead trees, but still the same sort of an effect. We might need to adjust the slope ranges on each of the layers to get it to be exact. And I do still have that function running on the lower layer in order to drop that down. But it shouldn't be existing within that function range. So we shouldn't really see that all that much. So if we want to decrease the size of the plum trees, go ahead and set those to 0.2, repopulate, and it'll start to fill in the area a little bit better. And there's another option too, which is to use the affinity with layer to drive and populate closer to the previous layer. So we can bring that up to, let's say, 50, repopulate, and now it's going to populate around those grouping of trees created from the previous layer. The repulsion from layer will work the opposite way and populate away from the instances on the layer below. So those are some pretty cool ways to vary the ecosystem and pretty easy to control.